Hi, I'm Steve Hansen with OfficeOutlet.com. The topic of this video is how do I bind SharePoint content type fields to ranges in Excel. I've got a content type set up in the document library for expense reports. So I'm looking at the content type here, and I've just got a few fields defined: who submitted it, what the purpose is, what the total is, and what the status of the expense report is. I've also set up an expense report document library, and in the default view I've added fields from the content type into the view. As you can see here, I've got the expense report as the default and only content type. So if I click New and do Expense Report, I get my expense report. And unlike Word, there's no direct way to bind ranges in Excel to content type fields. So in Word you can do this using content controls. In Excel I still get the content type fields as document properties, but as I add data to my expense report here, the purpose of the trip, my name, enter some values to generate a total. So one thing you can see, I don't get the real-time binding that I would in Word if I was using content controls bound to my content type fields. And when I save it out to SharePoint, unless I explicitly go up and enter values for those document properties, nothing's going to appear out in SharePoint. So if I go back to Excel and I duplicate the data that I've got in the spreadsheet and manually enter it into my document properties and then go save it, then those values do show up in SharePoint. Likewise, if I edit the properties in SharePoint, when I open the document back up in Excel, nothing is going to push those changes into my document. So I can see it was approved in the document properties, but what I'd really like to see is it reflect in the workbook itself. So what I'd like to do is build a way to automatically map items in Excel to the document properties so that I get the same type of behavior that I can get in Word. So to do this, I'm just going to modify the template I used for the expense report a little bit to enable the functionality. So I'm just going to grab a copy of the current template, and I'm going to add a new worksheet. And all this worksheet is going to do is map named ranges in my Excel workbook. And I'm going to create a named range for every range I want to map into a content type field. So name will be the submitter named range. I'll just name purpose, which will map to our expense report purpose. Total will be total. And the approved range will be status. So on my CT map, which for me a content type map, if you will, I'm going to list the named ranges that I want to bind to my content type fields, and then in column B put the content type field that should be mapped to the named range. Then one other thing I could probably do here, because you wouldn't probably want users, the end users, to really have to bother with this worksheet. I'm just going to go into the VBE and change the visibility of the CT map to very hidden. This means unless you go into the VBE, there's no way from the user interface to know that that worksheet even exists. So now I'm just going to save it as expense report, and I'm going to save it locally. And then I'm going to go out to SharePoint into my content type and upload the modified template as a new template for the expense report content type. So now every time you do new expense report in the document library, I better refresh, you'll get the modified version of the expense report workbook that I just created. And I needed to do that so now I can create an add-in for Excel that will be aware of the expense report content type, and when it sees it, it will use the hidden content type map worksheet to map ranges to content type fields. So to implement this functionality, we need to do a couple of things. One, before a workbook is saved, I need to look at the ranges and take their values and map them into the document properties. And then when a workbook is opened, I need to see if there's any content type fields, look at the values, map them to the appropriate ranges. So to do this, I'm going to use a couple of procedures, one called sync properties. And then another one called sync ranges. So before a workbook saves, we need to take the values that are in the ranges, the named ranges, and push those into the properties. So that will be sync properties. And then when we open a workbook, we need to look at the properties and then sync the ranges. So for sync properties, there's a couple of different collections to use that makes this really easy to do. So I'm going to have a props variable, which is going to be the collection of document properties. And then I'll use the built-in document properties property of the workbook object to get that collection. And then the variable CT props for the meta properties collection. And I'll use content type properties to retrieve that collection off of the workbook object. So one of the built-in document properties is called content type. So I'm going to look at the content type property, see if it's the expense report content type. And that's the only workbook, or the only class of workbooks this add-in will work on, will be when the content type is an expense report. Now I'm going to declare a couple of variables to make the mapping real easy. I'm going to have a worksheet variable for the map, the CT map worksheet, a worksheet expense variable for the expense report worksheet. And if you were implementing this in production environment, you'd want to make sure that these worksheet names actually exist instead of hard coding them as I have here. And then I'm going to use a range, and I'm initially going to set that to the basically cell A1 on the map worksheet. So to make this work, I'm going to just loop down the cells on the map worksheet until I find an empty one. So that's where the range value is nothing. So while not, range value 2 is nothing. And then all I'm going to do is set the content type field coming from column B equal to the value of the range name that is in column A of the map worksheet. Then after I map that, I'm just going to move down one row using the offset method. So range.offset1.0 means move down one row, don't move over any columns. So really thinking about sync ranges and sync properties, I probably could have just made this one method because there's only a couple of things I want to change for this. The first thing is to just simply change the order of value assignment here, so that this time I'm going to loop through and I'm going to set the value of the ranges equal to what I find in the content type fields. The one thing you want to be careful about is that if a range has a formula, you don't really just want to overwrite it with what you find in the content type fields. So that would make the worksheet or the workbook out of balance. So this really works best for text type ranges, or ranges where the numbers are basically inputs into other calculations. So I'm going to ignore whatever the change to the total should be because that's a calculated cell. Now I'll just go ahead and run the add-in. And I'll do a new expense report. Go ahead and fill in some values here. This isn't quite like Word the way I've got it right now because it doesn't bind things dynamically to the content type fields. You could look at the worksheet change event and make it so it would bind in real time. But as you can see here, it does bind before the save. So if I close and go out to SharePoint, I get the new workbook and I get all the content type fields filled in. Likewise, if I change a content type field out in SharePoint and then open the workbook in Excel, I'll see the fields are updated inside the document. So as you can see, there's while Excel doesn't have the native abilities to bind to SharePoint content types that Word does, using an Excel add-in, it's relatively easy to provide that type of functionality. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.